In a fiery congressional showdown, Jasmine Crockett dared to call out racial injustice in healthcare. But Ronny Jackson laughed in her face. He mocked her stories, insulted her intelligence, and called racial health disparities a myth. But Jasmine didn't just push back. She dropped the names of the forgotten dead, victims of a system built to ignore them. What happened next sent shockwaves through Congress, ignited a national reckoning, and pushed Jackson's career to the edge of collapse. So what did Jasmine say that turned the room from laughter to dead silence? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The clock struck 9 a.m. sharp when the heavy double doors of the Oversight Committee hearing room creaked open. Inside, the temperature felt colder than the air conditioning could explain. This was no ordinary session. Today's hearing, titled Equity in Post-COVID Recovery and Veterans Healthcare, had already sent shockwaves through Washington. Cameras clicked like distant gunfire as Congressman Ronny Jackson entered first, his navy lapel pin gleaming, his gait sharp, unapologetically smug. He shook hands with fellow Republicans, nodding to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Jim Jordan like a quarterback walking into a locker room before the big game. Jackson wasn't here to listen. He was here to dominate. He tossed his notes on the mahogany table with a thud and leaned back, exuding the aura of a man convinced that expertise equaled infallibility. His eyes briefly scanned the room, settling on the empty chair across from him, Jasmine Crockett's seat, and then she appeared. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the room with the kind of quiet intensity that made men look twice and shift uncomfortably. Her heels echoed with defiance on the marble floor, a dark blazer perfectly fitted, capping shoulders that had carried more injustice than most could survive. In her hand, a worn leather folder stuffed with data, affidavits, names, dates, lives. Her other hand adjusted sleek black glasses that mirrored the flash of every camera, but hid something deeper. Fire. As she approached the table, she didn't glance left or right. She didn't need to. The target was clear. The battle lines were drawn. Ronny Jackson looked up, and for a fraction of a second blinked. This wasn't just another Democrat. This was a woman who came from the ashes of racial erasure, systemic neglect, and public health failure. And she had come armed, with truth and rage sharpened into precision. And in that blink, the room changed. Gone was the illusion of routine politics. What remained was the raw tension between two forces hurtling toward collision. On one side sat Ronny Jackson, former Rear Admiral, White House physician, and bulldog loyalist of Donald Trump. Medals lined his resume, but so did controversy, accused of downplaying PTSD diagnoses, of brushing off long-term COVID data, of treating science like a political baton rather than a beacon. To him, this hearing was theater, and he came prepared to play the lead. His worldview was forged in hierarchy, orders given, questions silenced. His truth was uniformed, white-coated, and insulated from the cries of broken systems. He spoke for numbers, not names. He dismissed nuance, especially when wrapped in black skin or buried in poor zip codes. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, whose very presence ruptured that worldview like a scalpel through old scar tissue. A civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, she bore no medals, only memories. She knew what it meant to hold a mother's hand outside an ER and explain why her baby didn't make it. She had stood in morgues and forgotten clinics, in courtrooms where justice was just another word for delay. Her expertise wasn't born in war zones overseas. It was earned in America's medical deserts, where being black or poor meant your pain had to scream to be believed. Jackson spoke for control. Crockett spoke for those who had none. He came with rank. She came with purpose sharpened into something lethal, accountability. And this room, silent now, would soon have to choose which truth it could stomach. And just as the silence stretched long enough to feel sacred, Ronny Jackson leaned forward and shattered it like glass, with the ease of a man too used to never being questioned. His hands rested confidently on the polished oak desk, fingertips tapping as if counting down to provocation. The microphone caught the faint rustle of his papers, but his voice sliced through the air, smooth and deliberate, laced with contempt wrapped in professionalism. "Let me be absolutely clear for the record," he began. tone rehearsed like a man who'd spent a lifetime speaking without fear of contradiction. This committee, this administration, frankly, has become obsessed with pouring billions into what they call health equity. He made finger quotes in the air. But what it really is a social justice fantasy, a bottomless pit for taxpayer dollars, a solution in search of a problem. He leaned back, scanning the room like a teacher daring his students to disagree. We're here talking about how to fix a system that isn't broken. What's broken is the mindset, the narrative, the idea that somehow race, not personal choices, not family structure, not economic accountability, is why certain groups experience worse health outcomes. His eyes, cold and certain, flicked toward Jasmine with surgical precision. What we need is discipline, not drama, science, not sociology dressed up as science. Across from him, Jasmine had slowly lifted a thick chart from her folder, its title printed in bold. Black Maternal Mortality in the United States, CDC 2023. The numbers were undeniable. The image, 3 red bars towering over pale blue, wasn't theater. It was truth, backed by data. But Jackson never glanced at it. He didn't need to, because what he was really dismissing wasn't the chart, it was her. He chuckled, low and patronizing, before delivering the line that would hang in the air like smoke in a burning building. Congresswoman Crockett, do you actually have a medical degree? Or is this just something you read on BuzzFeed between protests? The sound in the chamber changed. Not silence, but tension, like the breath just before a scream, or the stillness before glass shatters. Chairs shifted. Pens froze mid-sentence. The insult wasn't just personal, it was systemic. A lifetime of belittlement distilled into 12 words. He hadn't merely questioned her expertise, he'd ridiculed her legitimacy. As a lawmaker, a black woman, and an advocate for lives his charts didn't even count. And Jasmine didn't flinch. Not yet. But a vein pulsed at her temple. Her lips pressed into a hard, silent line. The look in her eyes said everything. You've insulted the wrong woman, and you have no idea what's coming. And for one long, breathless moment, it seemed like Jasmine Crockett might strike back with fury. She had every right to. Every muscle in her jaw had tightened the moment Ronny Jackson mocked her chart. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table with such force that her knuckles paled against her skin. The insult, the smirk, the BuzzFeed jab, wasn't just a personal swipe. It was centuries of dismissal condensed into one smug sentence. She had heard that tone before, in courtrooms and hospitals and faculty lounges. It was the tone that said, "You're here because we let you be here. Don't forget your place." But Jasmine didn't explode. She didn't shout, didn't lean forward or fire back with the sharp sarcasm that many in the room were bracing for. Instead, she inhaled, deeply, deliberately, as if dragging air through every inch of history resting on her shoulders. And then she leaned into her microphone, slowly, and began to speak. Not like a politician, not like someone defending herself, but like someone bearing witness. "You want to talk about credentials, Doctor Jackson?" she said, her voice calm but resonant, the kind that made you listen even if you didn't want to. "You want to know if I have a medical degree? No, I don't. I have something else." She paused long enough for the room to realize they were about to hear something that couldn't be fact-checked, couldn't be spun. Something real. "I have the funeral program of my best friend," she said. "Tamika Johnson, 26 years old, first pregnancy, college graduate. She went to her OBGYN 3 times in her 3rd trimester, complaining of headaches, blurry vision, swelling. They gave her Tylenol, told her to rest, sent her home." A rustle moved through the chamber, not from Jasmine, but from those listening. Her voice wasn't shaking, but there was weight in every syllable, like each word was being carried from the depth of her chest. "She went into labor early. Blood pressure was sky high when she arrived, but they were short-staffed. No one rechecked her vitals for 4 hours. No one noticed she was slipping, until she coded." Silence. You could hear the faint hum of the air vents, the soft clack of someone's wedding ring nervously tapping the underside of a desk. Jasmine looked up for the first time. Not at her Democratic colleagues, not at the cameras, but straight at Ronny Jackson. She died because no one caught the preeclampsia, because no one listened when she said her head felt like it was splitting open, because she was a black woman in a system that treats black pain as exaggeration and black bodies as afterthoughts. She reached down into her folder and pulled out a photograph, slightly bent at the corners. Tamika's face beamed from it, radiant, full of promise, her hand gently cradling her baby bump. Jasmine held the photo in the air, then placed it on the table in front of her like it was evidence in a courtroom. And it was. She wasn't a statistic. She was my friend. She was a daughter, a sister, a church choir leader, and she's dead. Her voice didn't rise. That was the power. She didn't have to yell. Every word landed like a stone on glass. You talk about taxpayer dollars like they're more precious than people. Like what we're doing here is throwing money into a woke abyss. But I want to ask you something, Dr. Jackson. Her voice was colder now, sharper. How much is Tamika's life worth? Can you put that on a line item? Is there a number for what her mother would pay just to hear her laugh again? She paused. Because when you mock the need for health equity, when you roll your eyes at charts, when you call these investments fantasy, you're telling every mother who lost a daughter that their grief is political theater. You're telling me that Tamika's death was her fault. At that, several staffers lowered their eyes. One of the female aides covered her mouth with her hand, blinking fast. I'm not standing here asking you for sympathy, Jasmine continued. I'm asking you for recognition. Recognition that the system you swore an oath to serve has cracks so wide that people like Tamika fall through them every single day. And then you come in here and call our attempts to fix it fantasy. She picked up the photo again, held it chest high. This is the cost of your fantasy. And unlike your numbers, Dr. Jackson, this doesn't lie. No one spoke. Even Jackson, who had earlier lounged in his chair like the hearing was beneath him, now sat stiff, one hand resting near his thigh, the other clenched under the table. Jasmine took one final breath and delivered the blow that no chart could match. You asked if I have a medical degree. No, what I have is a lifetime of watching people who look like me die sooner, suffer longer, and be told it's just a coincidence. What I have is clarity. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you're the one who should sit down and listen. And then she stopped. She didn't add anything. She didn't need to. The weight of what she had said stretched across the room like a thundercloud. No one reached for a water bottle. No one whispered to their aides. Even the committee chair, a Republican, stared at his desk in stunned silence. Jasmine slowly returned the photo to her folder, as if laying Tamika to rest one more time. Her hands were steady, her spine straight. And in that moment, the hearing room didn't feel like a battleground. It felt like a reckoning. The silence that followed Jasmine's final sentence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Like the dead calm after a lightning strike, it held weight, danger, and the crackle of something shifting. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She didn't come to this hearing to share one story. She came with proof, layered, undeniable, and razor sharp. She reached back into her folder, the one Jackson had dismissed earlier as political theater, and began to lay down document after document, each with the cold, clinical precision of a prosecutor building a case. Since my credentials have been questioned, she began, tone icy but composed, let me present the data your colleagues never mention. Her fingers tapped on the table once, firmly, then held up the first page. CDC Report 2023. Black women are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. Not because of genetics, because of systemic failure. She didn't pause for permission. She kept going. NIH analysis 2022. Patients of color are less likely to receive pain medication in emergency rooms, even when reporting identical symptoms. Johns Hopkins, 2021. Black veterans have higher rates of undiagnosed hypertension and diabetes despite visiting the VA at the same rate as white veterans. She let each citation fall like a gavel. The committee room, once filled with side whispers and clicking pens, had gone still again. Not out of boredom, but out of reckoning. This is not anecdotal. This is peer-reviewed. This is the government's own data. Jasmine stepped up the intensity, not in volume, but in the power of restraint. You want science? Here it is. Line by line, table by table. If you're uncomfortable, good. Because for decades, comfort is the very thing that allowed this crisis to stay invisible. She flipped to a page and held it up high. This chart shows that Black newborns are more than twice as likely to die in hospitals when cared for by white doctors compared to Black doctors. That's not a headline. That's a published study in PNAS. Her gaze never wavered. Tell me, Dr. Jackson, is that woke science? Or are those dead babies just statistics? But just when it felt like Jasmine's words had finally forced the room to reckon with a reality too long ignored, Ronny Jackson shifted, not in panic, but in calculation. His jaw tightened as he adjusted his blazer, then leaned forward with the kind of cold calm that only comes from years of learning how to reframe, deflect, and deny. His fingers laced together, elbows planted like a fortress behind the microphone. I understand the emotion behind what the Congresswoman is saying, he began, voice coated with forced civility. But with all due respect, we have to be responsible here. Just because two things happen at the same time, race and health disparities, doesn't mean one causes the other. There it was, the pivot, the classic maneuver. With a few carefully chosen phrases, he tried to turn centuries of data into a coincidence. We have to look at this through a broader lens, he continued. There are countless factors that impact health outcomes. Diet, education, community infrastructure, family structure, even individual decisions about lifestyle. He glanced around the room, trying to reclaim the high ground under the guise of complexity. It's reductive, he said, to blame race. What we're seeing are environmental and socioeconomic patterns, not proof of some grand racist machine. That's just not supported by the data. The room, still fragile from the gravity of Jasmine's testimony, felt a new kind of tension, like watching someone try to shove a lid back on a boiling pot. Jackson smiled faintly, almost like a professor correcting a student. But what he didn't see, what he refused to see, was that Jasmine hadn't come here to argue theory. She came carrying names, lives, and grief wrapped in receipts, and she was not about to let him off that easily. Her chair didn't move, her voice didn't spike, she didn't lean in or raise a finger, but the shift in the room was seismic. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with focus so sharp it could split atoms. Let me see if I understand you correctly, she said, voice controlled like a blade unsheathed slowly. You're suggesting that Black mothers like Tamika died, not because of systemic failure, but because of where they lived or how they ate. That Black veterans are dying younger and being diagnosed later not because of bias, but because of their families. Her words were simple, but each one landed with weight because they demanded more than reaction. They demanded accountability. Dr. Jackson, if you're going to use science to dismiss pain, then I'm going to use science to prove it exists. Loud, clear, undeniable. She lifted the CDC chart again, this time not to display it, but to confront him with it. These are not isolated stories. These are not mistakes in a few hospitals. This is a pattern, a predictable one, across states, across incomes, across generations. She laid the paper flat on the table and pressed her palm against it like she was anchoring the truth in place. Her voice lowered, but the power behind it surged. You want to call it socioeconomic? Go ahead. But explain to me why socioeconomic disadvantage looks so much like my skin color. Why you can chart the life expectancy of Black Americans on a map and it matches redline neighborhoods from 70 years ago. Why Black babies are more likely to die even when their mothers have college degrees, even when they have insurance, even when they follow every rule this country claims to set. She took a breath, not for herself, but to let the room catch up. And then she went further. Do you know what it feels like, Doctor Jackson, to sit in an ER and know they're not hearing you? To explain symptoms and watch the doctor glance at the clock instead of your face? To have your vitals taken like a formality, not a lifeline? Her voice cracked, but not from weakness. It cracked like thunder. You can talk about data responsibility all you want, but people like me, people like Tamika, we live in the outcomes of your indifference. Now, even the Republican aides weren't typing. One of them, mid-30s, white shirt, navy tie, looked down at his hands as if trying to disappear. Jasmine pushed forward, still steady. And let me be absolutely clear. This isn't about blaming every doctor or shaming every institution. It's about stopping the denial. It's about naming the rot so we can finally cut it out. Because until people like you stop pretending that racism has to be intentional to be real, this system will keep killing people who look like me. She let the silence return, not to rest, but to echo. Because some truths don't need repeating, they just need space to land. And just when it seemed Jasmine's words had already cracked the foundation of the hearing, just when the room had settled into a stunned, heavy silence, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift occurred behind her. A staffer, no older than 30, stood from his seat with a calmness that felt rehearsed but resolute. His name wasn't known to the cameras. He didn't command attention with title or presence. But the object in his hand, a small, black digital recorder, held the potential to tilt the balance of the room. "Madam Chair," he said clearly, though his voice trembled ever so slightly at the edges, "we'd like to submit an audio recording into the official record." Heads turned. A murmur swept across the gallery like dry leaves in wind. Uncertain, hushed, bracing. The chair hesitated, just long enough for tension to thicken like fog. "Proceed," he said finally. The staffer pressed play. At first, the audio was simple background noise. Papers rustling, distant laughter, a half-muted cough. But then, unmistakably, Ronny Jackson's voice emerged. Calm, confident, off guard in the way only people speaking behind closed doors can be. "Don't waste money on those areas," he said. "They don't vote for us anyway." Another pause, then a casual chuckle. "Let them fix their own communities if they care that much. Or maybe they'll vote red next time." The words didn't land like an explosion. They landed like a slow, cold wave, swallowing the room inch by inch. For 2 full seconds, no one moved. Then, like a switch had been flipped, the energy snapped. Gasps rippled through the gallery. One reporter dropped their phone trying to hit record. Aides looked at each other, wide-eyed, as if waiting for someone else to confirm what they'd heard. A Republican congressman 2 seats down instinctively leaned back from Jackson, as though physical distance might shield him from the fallout. Even the stenographer, trained to remain neutral, mechanical, looked up from her keys, visibly shaken. The chair banged his gavel once. Then again, louder. His voice, usually steady, cracked under the weight of the moment. "This committee is in recess. 5 minutes. 5 minutes only. Everyone hold your position or clear the room. No more statements until we verify the source." But it was already too late. The court of public opinion had heard enough, and Ronny Jackson knew it. He shot up from his seat like he'd been lit from underneath. His face was red, not from shame, but fury. The calculated stillness he'd worn all morning shattered into something frantic, something raw and unfiltered. "This is a lie," he roared, pointing directly at Jasmine and her team. "This is fake. It's a deep fake. You think you can ruin a man's career with a cheap audio clip cooked up in a back room?" No one interrupted him. He didn't wait for validation. He was unraveling too quickly to notice. "This is a political hit job," he continued. "It's an ambush, a trap, a setup from the same people who've been after Trump from day one." His hands trembled, not with weakness, but the volatile rage of a man who felt the walls closing in. "You people have no respect for the truth, no respect for service. I gave 30 years to this country, and now I'm being crucified over some clipped audio from God knows where?" He turned toward the committee chair, as if begging for an ally. "Mr. Chairman, are we really going to let this circus continue? This is how reputations are destroyed. This is how you burn down institutions." But the chairman didn't answer. He was conferring in a low voice with legal counsel, eyes darting between the speaker and the transcript that had just been printed on the table. He didn't need to say anything. His silence said it all. Jackson's chest rose and fell, erratic, as the realization crept in. Not just that the words were out there, but that people believed them. The damage had already metastasized. Staffers were tweeting. Phones were vibrating across desks. Every second he spoke now only poured gasoline on a fire already licking at the walls of his credibility. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch. She didn't stand. She didn't smile or react in any way that could be construed as satisfaction. She just watched him unravel the way men with unchecked power do when finally cornered by truth they can't suppress and a voice they can't talk over. And as the gavel slammed and the hearing was forced into recess, Jasmine Crockett didn't even have to speak again. The world had already begun speaking for her. The clip, 3 minutes and 27 seconds, was posted on C-SPAN's official feed within the hour. But it didn't stay confined to government nerds and policy wonks. A low-res screen recording with shaky subtitles hit Twitter first. Then came the TikTok duets, the YouTube commentary, the side-by-side analysis. Within hours it was everywhere, Jasmine staring Jackson down, her voice clear, unflinching. The photo of Tamika lay gently on the table. And then, the audio, that calm, off-the-record voice saying, "Don't waste money on those areas. They don't vote for us anyway." By the 6th hour, Washash's Tamika Wasriel was trending globally. By the 12th, the clip had been viewed over 7 million times. By the 24th, it had shattered 15 million. Not because of algorithms, not because of celebrity shares, but because people saw themselves in Jasmine's silence, in her restraint, in her fury that didn't need fire to burn. And then came the wave no spin doctor could prepare for. One by one, the people whose pain had been hidden by charts began to speak. Not politicians, not pundits, but patients, nurses, paramedics, former military medics who had worked inside VA clinics. They flooded Instagram Live and Facebook Watch. They filmed shaky videos in parked cars, still in scrubs. Elderly black men in wheelchairs, holding up folders filled with denied VA claims. Latina mothers who had bled for hours in ER waiting rooms, while white women were seen first. A young veteran crying in his car, describing how a doctor had brushed off his chest pain as anxiety, only to find out a year later he'd already had 2 silent heart attacks. They didn't need scripts. Their pain was the script. "I was Tamika," one woman said through tears. "I treated Tamikas for 30 years, said a retired ER nurse. "They told me it was all in my head," said a man with a surgical scar running from his collarbone to his belly. Hashtags erupted like wildfire. Number YAMTAMIKA. Justice in healthcare. Listen to her. By day 2, these weren't just social media trends. They were national conversations. MSNBC opened with it. CNN brought in healthcare analysts. The New York Times ran a front-page feature titled, "How One Congresswoman Forced a Reckoning on Medical Racism." But in the eye of the storm stood Ronny Jackson, and he wasn't going to surrender without a fight. The next evening, he walked into a Fox News studio with the air of a man wronged, not guilty. The lighting was sharp, cold, designed to cast him in a war-zone palette of blues and grays. He wore his military lapel pin. The host, seated across from him, gave him a softball intro. Decorated Navy doctor, former White House physician, now under attack. Jackson leaned into the camera, voice perfectly modulated for outrage. What we're witnessing is the complete weaponization of race and outrage by the radical left. They took a line I said in a closed-door budget meeting, without context, and twisted it to make me look like a monster. He didn't blink. "I have served under 3 presidents. I've treated combat wounds in Iraq. I've held the hands of dying soldiers in the field. And now they want to destroy me because I questioned a flawed political narrative." He exhaled slowly, calculated, playing to the loyal base he knew would hear it. "This is a witch hunt. It's not about healthcare. It's about control. They don't want people like me asking hard questions." He paused, then added the line that would headline Breitbart by morning. "They're not coming after me because I'm wrong. They're coming after me because I don't kneel." But outside the frame, beyond the bright lights of the studio and the safe space of conservative punditry, the narrative was slipping through his fingers. Because no matter how polished his talking points were, he couldn't out-talk 15 million pairs of eyes who had already seen the truth for themselves. And Jasmine Crockett? She hadn't tweeted once. She hadn't posted a video, issued a statement, or called a press conference. She didn't need to. because the truth was speaking for her now, through the voices of every person who'd ever sat in a hospital waiting room and felt invisible, through every family who had buried someone too soon and been told, "We did all we could," through every medical form left unread, every ignored symptom, every sigh from a doctor who didn't believe you. She had lit the match, and now the fire was revealing everything that had been hidden. But as the roar outside Capitol Hill turned into a national reckoning, as stories poured in from emergency rooms and VA clinics, from broken homes and broken bodies, inside the marble walls of Congress, the temperature dropped. The fire Jasmine Crockett had ignited in public had unsettled too many comfortable men in private. And so, behind closed doors, far from cameras and microphones, the machinery of backlash began to turn. It didn't come in the form of open denial or televised outrage. It came in the oldest form Washington knows: a document. 48 hours after her testimony went viral, a coalition of Republican lawmakers, led by a senior representative from Florida and backed quietly by two subcommittee chairmen, filed a formal resolution with the House Clerk's office. The title sounded benign: Request for Verification of Data Sources presented before the Oversight Committee on Health Equity and Veteran Affairs. But the intent wasn't benign, it was surgical. They weren't attacking Jasmine's story, they were attacking her credibility, line by line, reference by reference. The resolution called for a comprehensive audit of every study, chart, and citation she'd used in the hearing: the CDC maternal mortality report, the NIH pain management disparities study, the VA's internal review on racial bias and triage. Even the PNAS peer-reviewed article on infant mortality was listed for methodological scrutiny. And the justification? Congresswoman Crockett has introduced emotionally charged narratives that may not fully reflect the complexity of the data. In the interest of objectivity and public trust, a review is necessary. It was cloaked in the language of fairness, but underneath it was an unmistakable effort to discredit her voice under the guise of due diligence. They weren't questioning the data because it was flawed. They were questioning it because it was too powerful, because it had already moved the public, because it had already started to reshape the national conversation, because it came from her. The resolution was hand-delivered to Jasmine's office in a sealed folder with a golden congressional crest. Her chief of staff handed it to her without a word. Jasmine sat at her desk, flipping it open under the dim lamp glow that made her office feel less like a workspace and more like a war bunker. She read every word, every footnote, every name on the signatory page. She didn't react, didn't curse, didn't stand. But something in her changed. She closed the folder with both hands slowly and pressed her palms against the top as if grounding herself through the paper. "They think data is just numbers," she said finally, voice low. "But behind every number I cited is someone who's already buried their Tamika." Her staff was silent, not because they didn't know what to say, but because they knew what came next. And the cruelty of it all was that they weren't even trying to refute the truth. They were just trying to drown it in paperwork, drag it into committee, weaken it by delay, muffle it beneath procedures, amendments, and endless reviews. They didn't want to disprove the pain. They just wanted to outlast it. Emails followed within the hour, from the committee clerk's office, from the Office of Congressional Ethics, from the House Science and Technology Subcommittee, all requesting clarification, sources, cross-reference backup materials. Jasmine's team was given 72 hours to submit every cited document in its original form, plus internal notes and communications used to prepare her testimony. A Republican aide off the record was overheard saying, "We'll drown her in her own footnotes." And yet Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't lash out on social media. She didn't go on a press tour. She didn't even respond to the resolution right away. Instead, she stood in her office late that night, staring at the Washington skyline, the dome of the Capitol glowing in sterile white light, and said softly to herself, "If they want to audit my facts, fine. I'll give them more than they asked for." Because Jasmine understood what they hadn't. When power tries to bury you in process, the only answer is to turn the process into a weapon. And as Jasmine Crockett's name echoed through the marble halls, not in scandal, but in strength, What began as a moment of confrontation became a movement of transformation. The firestorm had spread far beyond any hearing room. While her opponents tried to drown her in bureaucratic noise, something far more powerful had begun to emerge from the silence they left behind. Not just applause, not just admiration, but legislation. Within days, a draft began circulating among Democratic leadership. It started in quiet emails between committee staffers, then gained momentum through private briefings and closed-door sessions. The name on the header? The Crockett Health Equity Act. It wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. The bill proposed something no Congress had ever dared to codify at this scale: a federally mandated investigation into racial disparities in healthcare delivery across every major federal system: Medicaid, Medicare, the VA, and more. It called for the Department of Health and Human Services to publish annual disparity reports. It would require that the CDC and NIH track outcomes by race and zip code, not as a suggestion, but as law. And most critically, it would establish a permanent office for racial equity in public health, with the power to enforce reforms. This wasn't a gesture, it was a gauntlet. The bill's language was sharp, surgical. It didn't ask Congress to believe an anecdote. It demanded that it reckon with data. In its preamble were not just the statistics, but names. Tamika Johnson among them, listed as an emblem of every preventable death buried under the phrase complications. And in the final lines, clear as crystal, this act is named in honor of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose testimony revealed a systemic truth long denied. Even some centrist Democrats, long wary of alienating conservative districts, signed on, because the public was watching now. Voters weren't asking about abstract policies anymore. They were asking, where was this when my mother wasn't believed? Why did my son have to wait 6 hours while others were seen first? The bill had support not just in Congress, but in communities that had felt invisible for generations. And then came the letters. They didn't arrive all at once. They arrived like memory, slow, painful, and relentless. From Black veterans, Latino medics, Native American patients, Filipino nurses. Some were handwritten, scrawled in shaky cursive. Others were typed in all caps by men who had lost their sight to diabetes or war. Some came with photos, others with death certificates, and every single one told a story the system had tried to forget. One came from a retired Marine in Georgia. I served in 2 wars, but the hardest battle was getting someone to believe me when I said my chest hurt. They said it was stress. By the time they ran a scan, it was too late. My left ventricle was already damaged. Another came from a mother in Oakland, her son's folded flag still on the mantle. My son made it home. But when his liver began failing, they kept postponing appointments. Said the backlog was long. Said it wasn't urgent. He was 29. And another from a nurse who had worked inside the VA for 30 years. I saw it with my own eyes, the way the tone changed when it was a Black patient. The way complaints were labeled as non-compliant instead of underserved. We weren't allowed to say bias, so we called it workflow issues. But we knew. Within a week, over 3,400 letters had been cataloged and archived by Jasmine's staff. They created a digital map, red dots for every city, every rural town, every military base that had submitted a story. It looked like a constellation of the unheard. And then the flood intensified. 67 retired officers, some of them highly decorated, sent a joint letter addressed directly to the Speaker of the House. Typed on official letterhead, signed with military precision, and loaded with a simple but thunderous demand. We formally request that Congress reopen a full-scale review of the Veterans Affairs System's treatment of veterans of color. We request that this committee hold new hearings, not for political gain, but because justice delayed is justice denied, even in uniform. The letter didn't beg, it stood. It called out decades of silent discrimination wrapped in bureaucratic language. It pointed to disparities in disability ratings, mental health access, PTSD treatment, and pain medication approvals. And it ended with a sentence that rattled even the most hardened lawmakers. We were willing to die for this country. Now we ask it to finally treat us as if we lived. The moment hit Washington like a tidal wave. Suddenly, even those who had dismissed Jasmine as emotional, dramatic, or unprofessional were scrambling to reassess. Not because they changed their minds, but because the country had. Cable news couldn't ignore it anymore. CNN ran the story for 3 straight nights. NPR hosted veterans reading their own letters live. The Atlantic published a cover titled, "The Reckoning That Jasmine Sparked." Even conservative outlets were forced to cover it, some mocking, others conceding, "The pressure is real." And Jasmine? She said nothing for 3 days. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew the silence was doing the work for her. But the cameras didn't cut right away. The CNN anchor, normally polished and poised, sat frozen for a second too long. Jasmine's words had cut through the format of the show, through the scripts, through the glass and steel of the studio walls. This wasn't politics. This was survival, dignity, and resistance. Spoken not in outrage, but in exhausted, impenetrable truth. She didn't cry. She didn't soften. She simply let the silence linger. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. The nation heard her. Clips of the interview exploded across every platform within the hour, not in echo chambers, not in filtered feeds, but in real emotional ripples. A nurse in Baltimore watched it in the hospital break room, turned to her colleague and whispered, "She's saying everything we've lived." A Vietnam veteran sitting in a trailer outside Tulsa posted the clip on Facebook with the caption, "Maybe someone's finally fighting for us." A 19-year-old pre-med student in Oakland stitched the video on TikTok with tears in her eyes. "This is why I study. This is why I fight." The clip wasn't polished, it wasn't rehearsed, and that's why it pierced deeper than any press conference ever could. Back in Washington, the impact wasn't just emotional, it was seismic. 3 more Democrats co-sponsored the Crockett Health Equity Act overnight. Then a surprising 4th name appeared, Republican, Texas, a veteran himself. Not loud about it, just a quiet line added to the bill's co-sponsor list. But that was enough to shake the dome. By noon the next day, conservative media turned on him. Traitor, sellout, another Reno Falls. And yet something had shifted, because while the threats continued to flood Jasmine's inbox, now numbering over 1,000, some accompanied by doctored images and deep fakes, so did something else. Support in its rawest form. Hundreds of people, most of them strangers, sent physical letters to her office, some with no return address, many with trembling handwriting. One from a Black woman in Birmingham read, "When I heard your voice on CNN, I felt like someone had finally walked into the room where we were bleeding and said, 'I see you.'" Another came from a high schooler in El Paso. "I want to be like you, not because you're fearless, but because you fight even when you're afraid." And perhaps the most haunting of all, a simple note written on VA stationery in block letters from a man in hospice care. "I won't live to see the bill passed, but thank you for trying. Please keep trying." Meanwhile, the security detail around Jasmine intensified. She was now escorted to every event. Her car was swapped every 48 hours. Her home address had been scrubbed from every online database her team could find. She carried a panic button now, and still she showed up to every meeting, every committee, every floor vote. Glass or no glass, threats or no threats. She was done negotiating with fear. And then on a cold Thursday morning, something snapped the story open again. Capitol Police arrested a man loitering near the south entrance of the Rayburn building. In his backpack, zip ties, a knife, and printed screenshots of Jasmine's testimony. He had been flagged online days earlier, an extremist forum known for inciting political violence. His post called her the real domestic threat. When questioned, he said he was just scouting. The arrest made national news. This time, even members of Congress who had stayed silent were forced to speak. Some issued statements of solidarity, generic, cautious. Others, real ones, walked across the aisle and stood behind her in front of the press. One Republican, voice shaking, admitted on camera, "We may disagree on policy, but threatening someone's life because they demand equity? That's not conservatism. That's terrorism." But Jasmine, she didn't hold a press conference. She held a vigil. On the Capitol steps that Friday night, she stood with a candle in one hand and her folder of Tamika's story in the other. No podium, No microphones. Just her and a circle of volunteers, nurses, veterans, and staffers who had shown up uninvited one by one until the crowd numbered in the hundreds. She didn't deliver a speech. She read names, 30 names, real people, dead too soon, denied care, misdiagnosed, unheard. And when she finished, she said just one thing: "I'm not afraid of the glass, I'm afraid of silence." And just when it seemed the firestorm might finally subside, after the arrests, the interviews, the candlelit vigils, a new summons shattered the calm. Ronny Jackson had been called back to testify. This time not as a policymaker, not as a defender of the status quo, but as a subject of investigation. The charges were not criminal yet, but they were damning. Over a dozen veteran nurses had come forward in the weeks following Jasmine's televised speech. They were scattered across states, Texas, Alabama, Michigan, but their stories were chillingly similar. They had all worked under Jackson in various federal medical facilities, primarily within VA systems, and they all alleged the same pattern: that he had consistently dismissed, delayed, or outright ignored PTSD evaluations for veterans of color, especially Black men. One nurse submitted a sworn affidavit. "He told me once, these guys always think they've got PTSD. What they need is a job and a clock to punch." Another wrote, "He said trauma was being overdiagnosed, but he never said that to white veterans. Only the Black ones." The Oversight Committee moved swiftly. The media caught wind of the summons, and within 72 hours, the hearing was scheduled. This time, Jasmine Crockett would not be questioning. She would be testifying. The hearing room was packed before the gavel struck. There were no open seats, not even in the overflow chamber. Veterans lined the walls in silence, wearing medals on jackets worn thin from time. Nurses in scrubs stood near the back, holding folders thick with testimony. Capitol Police stood too deep along the entryway. This wasn't just political anymore. This was historic. Jackson sat at the witness table with his attorney. His eyes scanned the room, but they didn't settle. He looked less like a defiant warrior this time, and more like a man who finally realized the tide had turned and was not waiting for permission to crash. Jasmine walked in last. She wore a deep blue suit, tailored sharp. No jewelry, no notes. Her face was unreadable. The chair cleared his throat. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, you've been asked to provide sworn testimony regarding your previous allegations and your review of the submitted complaints. You may proceed." She stood, adjusted the microphone. Then she spoke. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. "I want to be very clear," she began, looking not at Jackson, but at the veterans seated behind him, "that what I say here today is not about revenge. It's about recognition. Recognition of the pain that's been ignored, the warnings that were dismissed, and the wounds that never made it into any file or chart." She reached into her folder and held up a stack of letters, copies of the ones her office had received. "These are testimonies, not from lobbyists, not from pundits, but from those who wore the uniform and came back to a country that labeled their suffering as inconvenience." Then she locked eyes with Jackson. "Congressman Jackson," she said evenly, "your record may show years of service, but it also shows a trail of silence. You had men in your clinics, combat veterans, who told you they couldn't sleep, couldn't breathe, couldn't live. And instead of seeing them, you judged them. Instead of treating their trauma, you treated their skin as a filter for credibility." The room didn't move. "You didn't just doubt their pain," she continued. "You delegitimized it. You called their PTSD a trend. You told nurses to stop referring too many Black males for psychiatric evaluation. You said, and I quote, 'They're just angry. That's not a disorder.'" There was no denial from the table, just stillness. Jasmine inhaled, calm, quiet, then shifted her tone. "I know Tamika's name is not in your records. I know the man in Houston who was turned away 3 times before his suicide isn't in your reports. But they are in mine, and they are here with us today." She gestured to the back of the room, where a mother held a folded photo of her son, Marine dress uniform, eyes too young to have seen what they did. A nurse next to her clutched a copy of a VA referral. never approved. Jasmine's voice lowered and somehow became even sharper. This hearing isn't about whether you took an oath. We all did. This is about whether you honored it. Whether in the quiet of the exam room, behind the desk, without cameras, you treated every veteran as equal, or whether you played gatekeeper to healing based on who they were. For 7 full minutes, she spoke. She cited data. She told stories. She read 3 names, then paused. She let the silence breathe. And then, in her final line, she delivered the sentence that would live on long after the hearing ended. What we do here is not just policy, it's triage. And the longer we wait to admit the truth, the more blood we leave on the floor. She sat down. The room was still. Then, without instruction, they rose, one by one. First the veterans, then the nurses, then the aides, then the committee members. A slow, collective rising, not of protest, but of acknowledgement. A standing ovation in a congressional hearing. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Jackson didn't speak again, and for the first time in his career, he didn't need to be removed. He walked out on his own, head down, alone. And even after the standing ovation faded, even after the lights in the hearing room dimmed and the transcripts were filed away, the fight did not end. Ronny Jackson still held his seat. He walked the same halls, voted on the same bills, appeared on the same talk shows. His name still bore the title representative. The scandal clung to him like a second shadow, but in the brutal arithmetic of politics, his base had not abandoned him. In some corners, he was now seen as a martyr, someone targeted by the radical left, punished for being honest. His allies closed ranks. His supporters flooded town halls, and the same machine that once shielded his silence now tried to smother the sound of the truth Jasmine had unleashed. But Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't fold. She adapted. She endured. She fought smarter. Every time the opposition tried to delay her bill, she brought another veteran to the floor. Every time someone questioned the need for race-based health audits, she recited names of those who never made it past a waiting room. She didn't fight for applause anymore. She fought for permanence. And quietly, something extraordinary happened. The bill, the Crockett Health Equity Act, did not die in committee like so many others before it. It survived. It was debated. It was revised. It was kept alive. It wasn't just filed and forgotten. It moved. For the first time in U.S. history, a federal health care bill named after a Black woman was scheduled for national floor debate. Cable news ran the headline across every channel. Crockett Act sparks nationwide conversation on health equity. It wasn't just a political event, it was a cultural rupture. Editorials ran in every major paper. Faith leaders invoked it in sermons. Universities hosted panels. Town halls exploded with testimony. Opponents tried to frame it as identity politics, but they were shouted down by nurses in worn sneakers, by veterans with old scars, by mothers holding photos instead of children. And for Jasmine, the cost had been steep. The death threats never stopped. The glass was repaired but never forgotten. She had lost nights, lost weight. Sometimes she lost sleep so deep it made her question the fight. But not once did she lose purpose. Because now when she returned to her district, she didn't walk alone. People followed her to meetings. Veterans shook her hand and whispered, "You said what we couldn't." Nurses brought her folded letters and hugged her like kin. Young girls in classrooms stood when she entered. And in one church on the east side of Fort Worth, someone had stitched her name, J. Crockett, into a quilt of civil rights leaders. She stood beneath that quilt one Sunday, looked at the faces, and quietly said to herself, "This isn't about me anymore. It never was." The night before the national vote on her bill, she walked into her office alone. The Capitol was quiet. The city was holding its breath. And in that silence, she sat at her desk and opened the first letter she had ever received about Tamika, from Tamika's own sister. The letter was wrinkled. The ink was faded, but the words cut like fresh glass. "I just want someone to say her name in a room where it matters." And Jasmine whispered, "I will." The next day, the Crockett Act was introduced for national vote. The chamber was full. The air was heavy. Some opponents gave speeches full of deflection about fiscal responsibility, about overreach, about how we can't legislate perception. But they were met with a wall of silent stares, because across the country, Americans were watching, and more importantly, remembering. When the votes were cast, the tally didn't break clean along party lines. A dozen Republicans crossed over. Some voted yes because they feared backlash, some because they saw the truth. One, an older veteran from Kentucky, stood up, looked Jasmine in the eye and said, "I didn't believe you at first, but then I checked my own records. You were right." The bill didn't pass that day, but it passed the floor, and it passed into history, because even as it moved to the Senate, where another battle awaited, the door had been opened, and it bore her name. Back in Fort Worth, Jasmine returned to the community center where she had once volunteered during law school. There was no stage, no cameras, just folding chairs and fluorescent lights. A child ran past her. A nurse handed her a clipboard. And as she walked through that room, the sound that followed her wasn't applause. It was trust, earned, carried, held with reverence. Because she hadn't just spoken truth to power, she had forced power to listen. And so, the story remains unfinished. Jackson still holds office. Jasmine still walks the long hallways. But now, whispers become witness. Silence becomes spotlight. And data becomes demand. Because somewhere between those two microphones, between the day glass shattered and the night her voice did not, something changed in the bloodstream of the country. And history will remember not just what she said, but what she revealed. Because when a doctor chose to look away, a lawyer forced him to see. But even after the camera stopped rolling, even after the votes were counted and the hearing rooms emptied into silent corridors, the story wasn't finished. Because what Jasmine Crockett had ignited was not a political spectacle. It was a reckoning. And reckoning doesn't end when the screen fades to black. It lingers in hospitals, in waiting rooms, in VA clinics, in policy briefs and handwritten letters, and in the quiet rooms where people have been suffering in silence for decades. This wasn't just about a corrupt congressman or a forgotten bill. This was about a system that had grown used to pretending that some pain mattered less. A system that dressed inequality in clinical language, buried bias under bureaucracy, and excused delay as protocol. A system that, for generations, had asked people of color to prove they were hurting, to quantify their suffering, to validate their trauma before being seen, not healed, just seen. And the most devastating part? It didn't start with cruelty. It started with indifference. That is what Jasmine came to destroy. She wasn't asking for a handout. She wasn't even demanding apologies. She was demanding recognition. She was demanding a country built on the promise of equality finally start keeping it. At the one place where it should be sacred, the exam table, the operating room, the emergency ward, the VA intake center. Places where skin color should never determine how quickly help arrives, or if it arrives at all. So what's the lesson? It's that injustice doesn't always wear a robe or carry a gun. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Sometimes it holds a clipboard and says, "Wait here." Sometimes it signs a form that never gets filed, or makes a note that says drug-seeking behavior instead of chronic pain, or calls it anxiety when the real issue is postpartum hemorrhage, or says malingering when the man across from them is reliving Fallujah every time he shuts his eyes. This is the lesson, that systems don't fail people. They are designed by people. And what's designed can be redesigned, but only if someone has the courage to break it open first. Jasmine did that. She took the fury of every mother who had buried a child after being told, "It's probably just stress." She carried the weight of every veteran who walked out of a clinic with more silence than care. She became the voice for people who weren't famous, who weren't trending, who didn't have hashtags. People like Tamika. People whose names were buried in forms, abbreviated, filed and forgotten. And that is the deepest truth of this story. Change doesn't begin when laws are passed. It begins when silence ends. Jasmine Crockett didn't walk into that hearing to yell. She walked in with evidence. She walked in with names. She walked in with a truth so grounded in pain, so anchored in data, that even those who wanted to look away had to look up. And in doing so, she forced an institution that had always assumed it was above accountability to answer to the people it had failed. Her victory wasn't a headline. It wasn't the bill. It wasn't even the standing ovation. Her victory was in the faces of those who finally felt seen. The black nurse in Detroit who'd been written up for insubordination after questioning a treatment plan that nearly killed a patient. The father in Mississippi whose son died after 3 ER visits with no imaging ordered. The retired veteran in Arizona who mailed Jasmine a note with just 6 words. "You said what we couldn't say." That's what justice looks like. Not vengeance, not punishment, visibility, credibility, voice. The ability to stand in a room of power, stare it down and say, "This time, you don't get to ignore us." And for all the threats, all the broken glass, all the exhaustion, Jasmine never ran because she understood something we all need to remember. That leadership isn't about volume. It's about truth. That advocacy isn't about anger. It's about refusing to let silence win. And that real courage is not measured by applause, but by whether you keep going when the room grows cold and your hands are still shaking. This story reminds us that policy is personal, that the numbers we quote, mortality rates, wait times, misdiagnosis stats, each contain a name, a body, a family, a future lost. And the only thing that stands between those numbers and justice is someone willing to say, enough. Someone like Jasmine. So what is the message? That justice doesn't trickle down. It is pushed forward by people who refuse to be moved. That the loudest stories aren't the ones screamed, but the ones told with the weight of lived truth. And that every time we allow injustice to be labeled anecdotal, we build another wall between power and accountability. But every time someone like Jasmine speaks up, we knock a brick loose. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day that wall will fall. And when it does, the first names we remember won't be the ones who built it. They'll be the ones who refused to let it stand. Because when a doctor chose to look away, a lawyer forced him to see. And if that wall is ever going to fall, we can't just watch. We have to act. Jasmine Crockett didn't step into that hearing alone so we could sit in silence. She risked everything, her safety, her future, her name, not to be admired, but to awaken us, to remind us that justice is not automatic and the truth will stay buried unless we dig it out together. So don't let her voice be the last. Don't let the Crockett Act become just another archive bill. Demand that your representatives read it, speak its name, challenge the silence in your own hospitals, clinics, and communities. Share your story, amplify the voices that have been dismissed for decades, because this fight isn't hers alone, it belongs to all of us now. Call your lawmakers, write the letters, organize the forums. Don't let them delay this with process and politics. Ask the hard questions. Who gets seen? Who gets heard? Who gets saved? And when they give you polite answers, push harder. Because somewhere right now, another Tamika is waiting in a hospital bed for someone to believe her pain is real. Somewhere, another veteran is being told to man up instead of being offered the care they earned. This is the moment to change that. Not tomorrow, not next session. Now. You have a choice. Be part of the silence or break it. The system counts on our fatigue. It thrives when we forget. But we won't. Not after Jasmine. Not after what she exposed. Not after the shattered glass and the 7-minute testimony that stopped a room cold. So don't just share the video. Share the responsibility. Make the next hearing louder. Make the next bill unstoppable. Make the next generation safer. Because the truth is out. The mirror has cracked, and what comes next is up to us. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.